I want to look at the Feast of Pentecost today and consider one message that I get from the remarkable story in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, verses 1 to 21, where at what was already a Jewish festival, the festival of Shavuot or Pentecost, Jesus' apostles, after his resurrection, are filled with his Spirit, which is also the Spirit of God poured out into their hearts and empowering them to overcome barriers of communication in order to preach the wonderful message of Jesus' overcoming of the powers of evil and hatred and even death itself to people gathered in Jerusalem for this festival. This outpouring of the Spirit is seen as one of the ways in which, in fact the way I suppose, in which the power of the risen Jesus continues to be seen in the world and among Christians after the end of his earthly ministry, of his earthly life. He was in a limited historical place and time, in a physical form, and once he had gone, once he was no longer available in that form, his Spirit could be poured out more effusively to all people at all times and in all places, and particularly among the Christians who preached his message. And this overcoming of the barriers of communication was one of the most powerful initial ways in which this happened in the story of Pentecost, as at least some, if not many, of the people who heard the message understood it, whatever their background and whatever the linguistic barriers there were to their understanding and appreciation of what the apostles were saying. And it's made very clear that the initiative for this comes from God. It is God's Spirit being poured out. The apostles are, in a sense, the receptacles of the gift, and they pass it on to the people. But I'm very much afraid that we can block the power of the Spirit. We can, in fact, refuse to be channels for its operation, or neglect to be. And there are ways in which I think this can happen within the church and also within human society at large. And if I look at tendencies within myself and how I can block the Spirit, I can in fact get quite worried about it and try to work to ways in which I can unblock the block and let the Spirit work through me. First of all, with regard to the church, I think there is a danger that in the church as an institution of which I'm a part, that like any institution, it has a certain language, a certain way of doing things, a certain sense of humour, a certain set of practices. And in different denominations and in different styles within a denomination, particularly within the Church of England, we can see these styles, these attitudes becoming very fixed, where there's a certain sense of humour, there's a certain way of doing things. And when we try to preach the wonderful message of what Christ has done to people outside the church, there can be a danger that we're in fact trying to encourage them to come into a certain way of doing things, to be preaching not Christianity but perhaps churchianity, to give them the impression that they have to sign up to a different sense of humour perhaps, a different set of attitudes, a different set of postures, and a different set of linguistic terms, a different way of talking, which is not necessarily holier and more godly and better than anything else, but is the style of the church to which we belong. And how to break through that, how to translate the message into a way that somebody outside the institution can benefit from, so that we remove the barriers and allow the Spirit of Christ to actually engage with them, is something that I find terribly difficult. But I think it is worth working at it, and not simply to preach in Christian churchy cliches and then expect people to understand what we're saying. But I think there's a bigger picture as well, in which communication, the gift of communication from God, can be blocked in life at large. And I think there is a problem in our political and social discourse at the moment, where we are encouraged to discuss with each other in a sort of echo chamber, where we simply discourse with, we talk to, we discuss things with people who share our own opinions, and we don't engage properly with people outside that realm of discourse. We're encouraged, and we encourage ourselves, to demonize those who are outside the community in which we are sharing our opinions. And I think that is extremely dangerous, because it leads to an increase in hostility, of demonizing people who are outside the group, of characterizing them as the other, whose opinions are not even worth listening to, let alone engaging with. And I think that is another way in which the power of God's Spirit can be blocked. And when I see myself perhaps being encouraged by the news feeds that are fed to me, where my own opinions are reflected back to me, and I think that I'm actually engaging with objective news when I'm doing nothing of the sort, if I can try to overcome that, if I can seek to communicate with people who have a very different perspective on reality from mine, a very different perspective on politics, then I can start to allow the Spirit of God to work through me. And it's not just a matter of active communication, it is also a matter of being prepared to listen, to be quiet, to hear what other people are saying, even if they're saying things that at first hearing I'm strongly inclined to disagree with. Maybe the problem lies partly in the need to translate what they're saying into things that I can understand and make sense of, and maybe even, perhaps partially or perhaps fully, reach a measure of common ground. And so I suppose on this Feast of Pentecost in 2019, I'm going to set myself two tasks. The first is, in my life as a church-going, church member Christian, to make sure that I convey the message of my faith in a language that makes sense to people outside my own charmed institution. And in my wider engagement in society, to be prepared to try to communicate with people who have a very different perspective on reality from mine, to be prepared to listen to what they are saying and allow the healing Spirit of God, the healing Spirit of Christ, to work through what I'm doing and achieve something of the reconciliation which at the moment we all so desperately need. Well, thank you for listening, and please do post a comment if you like, and subscribe to the channel as well if that takes your fancy.